When powerful people accuse a religion or a race of being a danger to society, what should Christians do? When our president tells us that Muslims threaten our peace and safety, how should we respond? What would Jesus do? Well, I believe he would want to know the facts of the case. According to the FBI, 94% of the terrorist attacks carried out in the United States from 1980 to 2005 have been by non-Muslims. This means that an American terrorist suspect is over 9 times more likely to be a non-Muslim than a Muslim. In fact, another study shows that between 2001 and 2015, more Americans were killed by homegrown right-wing extremists than by Islamist terrorists, according to a study by a nonpartisan think tank. Another study showed that between 2008 and 2016, there have been about 4 times as many terrorist attacks by right-wing groups as by Islamicists, and most of the Islamist attacks were actually by Americans, not by foreigners. Well, what about in Europe? Well, according to Europol, the EU agency charged with tracking statistics relating to violence and terrorism, in 2013, there were 152 terrorist attacks in Europe. 2 of them were religiously motivated. In 2012, there were 219 attacks, 6 of them religiously motivated. If all Muslims are terrorists because of these very small percentage of terrorist attacks undertaken by Muslims, then by that same logic, all Muslims are peacemakers. Did you know that 5 of the last 12 Nobel Peace Prize winners have been Muslims? There are about 100,000 militant extremist Muslims in the world, according to scholarly calculations. That's less than 0.01% of the global Muslim population of 1.7 billion. Most of these militants are fighting in battlefields in northern Africa, in the Middle East. A small group can be found, obviously, in Europe, and an even smaller group in the United States, and we certainly need to guard against these. But they are by no means our largest security threat. Pew recently did a poll showing the views of American Muslims. Those that have arrived in America since 1990 are about as likely as Christian Americans to prioritize their American identity over their religious identity. In fact, Muslims are much more likely than evangelical Christians to see themselves as Americans first and Muslims second. The fear that Muslims may be more loyal to Muslims around the world than they are to their own country is unfounded. A Gallup poll showed that in 2010, Muslim Americans were the least likely of any American religious group to strongly identify with co-religionists overseas. U.S. Muslims score higher than most other religious believers on Religious Tolerance Index. They are more likely also to oppose violence in the name of religion or militarism. A 2010 Gallup poll asked whether, quote, targeting and killing civilians by the military can be justified. The U.S. Muslims were the only religious group that opposed such targeting. Muslim Americans were also the most strongly opposed of any religious group to targeting and killing by individuals or small groups. The fact is, Americans murdered more people on any 2 days last year than were killed by terrorists in the last 10 years. Shutting down mosques, banning Muslims, shutting down our borders to Muslims will not make America safer. Rather than treating them as our enemies, we should see Muslim Americans as our allies in the fight for freedom and peace. Now I've covered this factual background, I want to talk more specifically about what Jesus, I think, would say about Muslims, and that's what we'll cover in part 3 of our video series. That is Protest and Liberty Today.